She left New York pregnant, heartbroken, and completely alone. 3 years later, Ren returned with a successful company, a brilliant son, and the strength she never knew she had. This isn't just a story about betrayal, about motherhood, resilience, and building a new life from the ashes of the old one. Sometimes the people who break you accidentally force you to discover your true power. If you believe in second chances and strong women, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.
The candles were already glowing as Ren Calloway placed the last dish on her penthouse dining table. She had spent the entire afternoon cooking. There was a roast chicken glistening with herbed butter, freshly baked bread, and 2 glasses of sparkling water, because she couldn't drink alcohol anymore. Not with the secret she was carrying. She rested one hand on her stomach. 8 weeks. She had taken 3 different pregnancy tests, and every single one came back positive. She'd practiced the words all week, rehearsing in the mirror of their 34th floor apartment as Manhattan burned orange outside the massive windows. Her plan was perfect. Beckett's keys dropped into the bowl by the door at 8:14 p.m. She heard the soft thud of his jacket. Then, the familiar click of his shoes on the marble floor. She picked up the small card she'd written, with just 3 little words inside, and held it behind her back. That's when she heard his voice. It was low and warm, in a way he hadn't spoken to her in months. She walked toward the hallway, and then she froze. His phone was propped against the wall charger, the screen facing her. It was a video call. A woman named Sloane Mercer filled the screen. She had dark hair, high cheekbones, and a Cartier watch that glinted in the light. But it wasn't Sloane's face that made something inside of Ren shatter. It was the way Beckett was laughing. So free, so easy, like a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. Or maybe he was just a man who hadn't been caught yet. Ren stood perfectly still. As a designer, she saw every single detail in those 11 seconds. The angle of his body, the soft way he said the word tonight, as if it held a secret promise. She backed away into the kitchen, placed the card face down, opened her laptop, and typed 3 quick sentences to Jasper Whitfield, the lawyer who managed her father's estate. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she went to the home office, Beckett's private space, always locked. But he had gotten careless and found the USB drive sitting right beside his keyboard. She plugged it in and started copying everything. The progress bar crawled. 2%, 18%, 67%. She pulled it out at 94%. It was good enough. By the time Beckett walked into the kitchen, Ren was already putting on her coat. "You're going out?" he asked, frowning at the untouched dinner. "Yes," she said, her voice completely steady. She grabbed her bag. She didn't look at the card on the counter. She didn't touch her stomach. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited for the doors to slide open. She stepped inside. On the counter, the card said, "We're going to be 3. She left it sitting right there. The drive to Philadelphia should have taken 2 hours, but Ren made it in 90 minutes flat. Her mother, Carla Calloway, opened the front door before Ren even had a chance to knock. She must have heard the car, and after one look at her daughter's face, she didn't say a single word. She just stepped aside. She just put the tea kettle on. Ren sat at the old kitchen table, where she had done her homework as a kid, where her father, James, read the paper every Sunday, where they ate every Thanksgiving until he got too sick to sit up. The kitchen still smelled of cinnamon and old wood, just like it always had. She pressed her palms flat against the table and took a deep breath. "I found something," she said. On Beckett's USB drive, Carla placed 2 mugs on the table. "What kind of something?" Ren opened her laptop and found the file. It was a contract from 8 years ago, scanned and buried inside 3 different folders. Her father's name was right there on the signature line, James A. Calloway, lead architect. The project was the famous Lorne Meridian Tower on 6th Avenue, the very building that made Beckett's father, Conrad Lorne, a giant in New York real estate. The contract had a royalty clause, a fee-sharing deal for the design rights that, over 8 years, would be worth about 28% of the entire Lorne Meridian group. And it had never been paid. Carla sat down hard, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. "Your father tried to get that money for 3 years," she said. "Conrad's people claimed there was a mistake in the contract. Then they just stopped answering his calls." She paused and swallowed. "Then the work just dried up. All of it. Every single client disappeared. Your father always thought it was just a bad economy." "It wasn't the economy," Ren said, her voice quiet. "No." Ren stared at the screen. Her father had died 5 years ago, broke and exhausted, convinced that he was a failure. He had designed the very building that created an empire, and he died thinking it was his own fault. He had nothing to show for it. Carla reached over and touched her daughter's hand. "Is there anything else? Do you remember Jasper Whitfield? He called me 6 months after the funeral. He said he was holding the original signed contract, the one with the real notary stamp. He told me he was waiting for the right time." Just then, Ren's phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Calloway, this is Jasper Whitfield. I know tonight was probably difficult. I have waited 8 years to hear from your family. When you are ready, I have everything." Ren read it again, then looked up at her mother. "I'm pregnant," she said. Carla closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, they were shining with tears. "Well then, you have even more of a reason to fight." Ren nodded slowly. Outside, a soft, steady rain began to fall against the old window. She thought of the card on the penthouse counter. She thought of Beckett's easy laugh on that video call. She thought about her father's name on a contract that was never honored. "I'm not filing for divorce," she said, her voice low. "Not yet." Carla looked at her, confused. "First, I'm going to disappear," Ren said. "And when I come back, I'm going to be the one holding all the cards." She closed the laptop, drank her tea, and began to make her plan. 3 years can change you in ways you do not see coming, not in big, dramatic moments, but in all the small, quiet ones that add up until you are someone else entirely. Ren Calloway's office, on the 3rd floor of an old warehouse in Los Angeles, smelled of drafting paper, cold brew coffee, and the lavender candle she always lit during long client calls. Her walls were covered in architectural blueprints and fancy certificates. She had won 3 national design awards in just 3 years, a career that made others in the industry wonder, where did she come from? She never gave the same answer twice. Her firm, Calloway Studio, now had 6 employees, a long waiting list, and an article in Architectural Digest that her mom had framed for her kitchen in Philadelphia. And every evening at 6:15, Ren's assistant would knock on her door to say good night, and Ren would close her laptop, grab her bag, and drive her simple white Toyota Camry 12 minutes to the apartment where Theo was waiting. Theo was 3 years old. He had his father's dark eye and his mother's stubborn mouth, and his favorite thing to do was build things out of whatever he could find. Cardboard boxes, sofa cushions, wooden blocks. He would stack them with a natural feel for design that made Ren's heart ache in a very complicated way. "Mama, look," he said that Tuesday, pointing at a tower he had made from old Amazon boxes. "I made a building." "That is a wonderful building," she said, kneeling down beside him. "Tell me all about it." "It is really tall," he said with a serious look, "and nobody can knock it down." She kissed the top of his head and did not cry. She had gotten very good at not crying. Later, after Theo was asleep, curled around a stuffed elephant with one protective arm, Ren sat on the counter, eating leftover rice and scrolling through news on her phone. A headline made her stop. Lorne Meridian Group files for New York Stock Exchange IPO with a projected $2.3 billion valuation. She read the article twice. Then she called Jasper Whitfield. He answered on the first ring as if he had been expecting her. "I saw it too," he said instead of hello. "The royalty clause in the contract," she said. "How long is it good for?" There was a short pause. "There is a 10-year window on the enforceability clause. That was standard for contracts back then." He paused again, choosing his words carefully. "Ren, if they go public, the corporate restructuring will legally wipe out the original contract terms. Forever." She glanced at the clock on her microwave. It was 11:47 at night. "How many days are left?" she asked. 47. For a long time she said nothing. From the bedroom, she could hear the soft, steady breathing of her son, Theo. "Book 2 tickets to JFK for me," she finally said. "I will call you back with the dates." After hanging up, she just sat there in the dark. She thought about the life she had built. She thought about everything they had stolen from her. Then she opened her laptop and began to write a list. The JFK airport at 6 in the morning smells like jet fuel and bad decisions. Wren felt neither. She walked through arrivals with Theo on her hip and one bag over her shoulder. She wore dark jeans, a gray wool coat, and no jewelry at all. Nova was there waiting, leaning on a post with her arms crossed, holding 2 Starbucks cups. She had that. Look, the kind you get from staying up all night and loving every minute of it. "You look terrible," Nova said, giving her a coffee. "You look like you drove here from another time zone," Wren shot back. Brooklyn. Close enough." Nova glanced down at Theo. "Hey there, buddy." Theo just stared at his aunt. "Your hair is red now." "Yes, it is." "Why?" "Because I felt like it." He considered this. "Okay." He then reached for her coffee. She let him touch it for a second before pulling it away. He laughed. That was them, their entire relationship figured out in less than a minute. They took a taxi to Midtown East, far away from the Upper East Side. Wren had found a sublet through a work friend. It was a furnished 2-bedroom apartment on 51st Street. She paid for 3 months in cash, under the name Callaway Studio. There would be no paper trail. Jasper was waiting for them when they arrived. He was 70 years old, with silver hair, in a suit that looked perfect, even at this early hour. He shook Wren's hand, looked at Theo for a moment, then back to Wren. "He has his grandfather's eyes," Jasper said softly. "James would have been so happy to see him." Wren said nothing. She got Theo settled in the bedroom with a tablet and some headphones, then joined Jasper at the kitchen table, where his files were spread out. The case was solid. The original contract was officially notarized. The clause about royalties was absolutely unbreakable. James Callaway had signed it with honest intentions, and Conrad Lorne had buried it with dishonest ones. If it was argued correctly in front of a federal judge, the damages could mean a huge cash payment or a transfer of company ownership. "We have one problem," Jasper said. "Conrad has judges in his pocket," Wren stated. 2 of them in the Southern District. He pushed a folder toward her. "But not in the Eastern District. I have already filed an initial motion over there." Wren nodded. "What is next?" "The timing is going to be tight," he said, pausing. "And Beckett's legal team plays rough. The moment they find out someone is challenging the IPO, they will attack us with everything they have." "Good," Nova said from the counter, while eating an apple. "We want them worried." Wren looked down at the table, at the mountain of paperwork. 3 years of waiting, and now 47 days to go. Her 3-year-old son was asleep in the other room. And just then, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. It was a text. "Callaway. I know you're in New York. I want to propose something that could help us both." Harlan. She stared at the name. Dex Harlan. He was Beckett's biggest competitor. She'd never spoken to him. She had not told a single person she was back in the city. She showed the phone to Nova, who just lifted an eyebrow. "How could he possibly know?" Nova asked. "That's exactly what I'm going to find out," Wren replied. She told herself not to do it. But then she did it anyway. Le Bernardin on West 51st was just 12 blocks from her apartment. She walked through the cold, hands buried deep inside her coat pockets. She just needed some fresh air, she reasoned. This wasn't really about him. The November wind blew hard from the Hudson River, and she leaned into it as if it were a punishment she deserved. She stood across the street. Through the restaurant's large windows, warm light spilled onto the wet sidewalk. She could see everything inside. White tablecloths, flickering candles, the quiet performance of wealth. It took her 4 seconds to find them. Beckett was at a table in the corner. He looked just the same. No, he looked even better, which somehow felt worse. His suit was darker. His hair was a little shorter. He was talking, And whatever he said made Sloane Mercer give a slow smile. It was the kind of smile people use when they're pretending to be happy, but the act is just slightly unconvincing. Wren only watched for 40 seconds. That was all. She didn't feel the anger she thought she would. She felt something quieter and far more dangerous. It was clarity. This man had spent almost no time at all trying to find her. He had filed some papers, she knew that much. She knew he filed for divorce, but never finalized it after 6 months when she was gone. He had simply moved on. He built his IPO. He lived his life. She walked back to the apartment. The city felt huge and didn't care about her at all. And for that, she was thankful. New York City didn't care about her broken heart. It never did. That was why she had always loved this place, and why she had to get away. Theo was asleep when she got back. Nova was on the couch reading her Kindle, with her feet tucked under her, a lamp glowing beside her. "You went, didn't you?" Nova said. It was not a question. Yes. And what happened? Wren hung her coat and perched on the edge of the couch. "He looks fine," she said. "He looks completely and totally fine." Nova was quiet for a second. "You already knew he would. Knowing something and seeing it are very different." "Yeah." Nova set down her Kindle. "Have you cried yet?" "No." "You can." "I will not say a word." Wren pressed the palms of her hands into her eyes. She took one breath, then a second. The third one broke something she'd kept locked away for years, and she cried silently, for exactly 4 minutes. And then she was done. She wiped her face and opened her MacBook Pro. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Nova repeated. "Now I'm ready." She opened Jasper's files. "We need to get the full hearing schedule for the Eastern District. I want to know the exact date we can get in front of a judge." Nova got up from the couch and came to look over her shoulder. "Also," Wren said, "text Harlan back. Tell him I can meet. Coffee only, somewhere public. He can pick the place, but I will pick the time." She never looked up from the computer screen. Her eyes were dry now. It was time to get to work. Tex Harlan was not what she had pictured. She was expecting the typical Wall Street type, the aggressive attitude, the power handshake, the whole performance. Instead, he was sitting at a corner table in a coffee shop on Lexington Avenue, reading an old book and making notes in the margins with a pen. A half-finished Americano sat next to him. He looked like a man who was always doing 2 things at once and had decided a long time ago not to apologize for it. He stood up when she approached. He was tall and composed. It wasn't like Beckett's cold, calculated stillness. This was a comfortable kind of calm, like someone who realized that rushing was a choice and he simply chose not to. Calloway. "Harlan." She sat down but did not offer her hand. "How do you know that I am in New York?" "I have a source in the Eastern District Court system who flags interesting new cases for me," he said. "Your lawyer's motion appeared in the system 2 days ago. Your name was right there on the document." She took in the information, but her face showed no reaction. "What is it that you want?" He closed his book. "Lorne Meridian's IPO will give them complete control of commercial real estate along the Hudson, an area I have been working in for 6 years," he continued. "If the IPO goes through, Conrad will reorganize, take over 3 properties where I have competing bids, and shut me out of a market I have spent a fortune to build." "So you want to use my lawsuit to destroy his IPO?" "I want to pay for your lawsuit," he corrected her. "All legal expenses, Jasper Whitfield's retainer, expert testimony, court fees, all of it will be paid for. And you want nothing in return, except that the lawsuit moves forward." Wren watched him closely. "That seems like a very generous offer for no clear benefit to you." "The benefit is the result," he said, lifting his coffee cup. "If Conrad misses his IPO window, his entire deal falls apart. That is worth much more to me than what your legal fees will cost. And if I win company stock instead of cash, you get nothing." "That is correct." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "You are not a good man, Mr. Harlan. You are using my father's stolen contract just to protect your own investments." He didn't even blink. "That is an accurate statement. But at least you are not pretending to be something you are not," she said. "No." She held her coffee with both hands. I will use your money, but I make every single decision. Strategy, timing, settlements, that's all me. You don't talk to my lawyer without me. You don't contact anyone in this case. You are just a checkbook. Nothing more." He was quiet for a moment. Then his expression shifted to something that wasn't quite respect, but it was close. "Agreed." She stood up. "I'll have Jasper send over the fee structure." She grabbed her bag. "One more thing. Do you know Sloan Mercer?" A tiny flicker of tension appeared around his eyes. "We've met. Nova tells me you two have some history." "Nova is thorough," he said. "Yes, she is." Ren held his gaze. "If this is personal for you too, I need to know now." Personal feelings have a bad habit of complicating things at the worst possible time. He glanced out the window at the street below. "Then it's personal. And it's business. Both can be true. Then keep them separate," she said. "Or this arrangement ends immediately." She left. On the sidewalk, she texted Nova a single word. "Confirmed." Nova's reply was instant. "Buckle up." The Eastern District Federal Courthouse in Brooklyn is the kind of building that makes you feel its importance before you even get to the steps. Ren arrived 11 minutes early. She dressed to look capable, not flashy dark blazer, a simple bag, and flat shoes. Jasper was already there, speaking with a clerk. She took a sip of water and opened the hearing notes on her phone. She was reading when the main doors swung open. She knew who it was without looking. Some sounds you never forget, even after years. A certain walk, the sound of specific shoes on a marble floor. She turned, because not turning would feel like admitting fear, and she was done with that. Beckett Lorne stopped dead, just 6 feet from her. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, and he looked exactly like the man she'd left, but also nothing like him. 3 years had changed him. He wasn't older, just sharper, like some layer of his careful control had been stripped away. In that first quick look, he just seemed like a man who hadn't slept well in a very long time. His legal team stopped right behind him, 4 people, just watching them. Ren met his eyes for only 2 seconds. Then she looked back down at her phone. "Ren." His voice was different, quieter than she remembered, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to say her name. She looked up. "Mr. Lorne," she said, her tone pleasant and professional, as if she'd never met him. "I'm sorry. I just need to review something before we head in." She walked right into the hearing room. She could hear his team whispering that she was the one suing him, but Beckett said nothing. Inside, Jasper leaned in and whispered, "How are you doing?" "Fine," she said. "You just walked past Beckett Lorne like he was a ghost." "I did, and you're fine." She set her phone down on the table and folded her hands on top of it. "I will be," she said. "Ask me again in about 43 days. The hearing went on for 90 minutes, filled with procedural stuff, motions, scheduling, and a debate over jurisdiction that Jasper handled like a complete pro. Conrad Lorne's lawyers tried to block the contract from being used. So, Jasper just pulled out a certified copy of the original notarized document. The room went dead silent. Ren didn't even look at Beckett when the paper came out. Her eyes were fixed on Conrad Lorne in the second row. He was 65 and radiated power, the kind of man who'd spent a lifetime getting away with things. But when he saw that contract, his face changed. It was pure fear. In that moment, Ren got it. He always knew this day could come. He just bet that James Calloway's family would never be organized enough, rich enough, or angry enough to challenge him. He had bet wrong on all 3 counts. That night, Beckett confronted his father at the Lorne family home on East 71st Street. It was the house he grew up in, where Conrad still kept his main office on the first floor. The staircase was lined with portraits of stern-looking men in suits, a constant reminder of who you were supposed to be. "Tell me about the Calloway contract," Beckett said. Conrad was at his desk, jacket off, glasses on, reviewing the same documents from the hearing. He didn't look surprised. He'd had all afternoon to prepare his story. "There was a problem with the original wording," Conrad said. "The section on royalties was unclear. Legal reviewed it in 2017 and said it wasn't enforceable. That's not what this lawsuit claims." The lawsuit is a shakedown by a woman who's just looking for money from that woman's father designed the 6th Avenue building. Beckett cut in, his voice flat. Our flagship building, the one that made this company. Conrad took off his glasses. James Calloway was paid for his work. The design fee, yes, but not the royalties. The royalty clause was I read the contract, Dad. He hadn't, not yet. But the way he said it made Conrad stop cold. I need the truth, not the version your lawyers created. Conrad watched his son for a long moment, then carefully spun a version of the truth, perfectly polished with a lifetime of practice. Yes, he admitted, there was a clause. Yes, they let it lapse. And yes, Calloway had complained, but he was handled, and eventually, he just stopped trying. I made a business decision, Conrad said. That's what leaders do. You protect the company. Beckett just stared at him. So he died thinking he was a failure. People make their own choices. He designed your greatest achievement, and you buried his contract and let him think he failed. Conrad stood up. I built this entire company for you. Everything in this room, everything with your name on it, I built. And I protected it. That's what a father is supposed to do. Beckett didn't answer. He just grabbed his jacket from a chair. I'm putting together a full legal response to this lawsuit, he said. We'll fight them on the contract's timeline. He left without another word. For 11 minutes, he just sat in the dark in the back of his Mercedes, parked right outside his father's house. Then he called his head of legal and told them to build the defense. He told himself he still believed his father, because if he didn't, then his entire life as he knew it would just fall apart. That night, alone in his penthouse, which felt so wrong, so quiet in that awful way a room does when someone is gone, he pulled out his phone. For the first time in 2 years, he searched for Wren's name. Calloway Studio, Los Angeles. Award-winning and growing fast. He stared at her picture on the company's website for a long time. Then he put his phone face down on the cold marble counter. He had a counter motion to file. He had an IPO to protect. He had a company built on his father's decisions, his own ambition, and on things he was only now beginning to doubt. He went to bed at 1 a.m. and slept terribly. To be honest, he hadn't slept well in 3 years. But he wasn't always honest with himself, and he was just starting to figure that out. The ruling came in at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Jasper read it first. He stood in the courthouse hallway holding the paper, and Wren saw him try to keep his face perfectly neutral. She knew that look. She'd seen it on clients just before she gave them bad news about a budget. Tell me, she said. The judge ruled the royalty clause can be used as evidence, Jasper said slowly. However, he paused. There's a technical problem with the notarization. The signature of the second witness, the person who verified James's signature for the notary, their identity can't be confirmed. He continued, without a living witness or another record, the notarization is invalid under New York law. Without a valid notarization, the contract isn't legally binding. We can still argue the case, but we have to start from scratch with different proof. He folded the paper. The judge hasn't thrown out the case, but we just lost our most important piece of evidence. Nova was standing nearby with her arms crossed. She turned and walked to a window, pressing her hand flat against the glass without a word. Wren stood perfectly still, doing the math in her head. Her 47 days had just turned into 31. Without the notarized contract as their foundation, they had to rebuild their entire case with other documents, emails, financial records, old letters. It was possible, but it was going to be so much harder. Who was the second witness? She asked. Jasper waited just a fraction of a second too long to answer. Jasper, the second witness, was listed as P. Lauren, he said. Petra Lauren, Conrad's wife. Wren just stared at him. You knew this? I knew her name was on the document. I didn't know if she was alive or where to find her. I should have looked into it more. That's my mistake, and I'm sorry. Wren looked toward the ceiling and took a long, slow breath. Where is she now? She's been out of the public eye for 2 years. There were rumors about her health. I'd need to find her, Wren cut him off. Today. She walked to the courthouse exit alone, pushed through the heavy doors into the cold November air, and just stood on the steps, looking out at the Brooklyn skyline. Model. Gray sky, gray water, and a city that just kept moving, completely unaware of her personal crisis. She took out her phone to call Theo's babysitter. Theo was great. He had eaten his entire lunch. He had even built a fort out of pillows. He was perfectly fine. She hung up and stood there for another minute, just thinking. Then she made herself remember the real reason she was here. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even completely for her father, although he deserved justice. She was here because somewhere in a Manhattan penthouse, another contract had been broken, the one concerning a 3-year-old boy. It was the unspoken promise between a child and the father who had no idea he existed. And time was quickly running out on that contract, too. She walked to the subway, pulled out her Kindle, and opened a page she had bookmarked in Meditations. It was a sentence she had been reading for 3 years. You have power over your mind, not over outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. She read it 3 times. The train pulled in. She got on board. She was not going to give up. Petra Lauren had chosen Bryant Park for their meeting because she enjoyed watching people. Ren understood that. She knew exactly what it felt like to want to be surrounded by motion when your own life feels completely stuck. Petra was already at a table when Ren arrived, wearing a camel-colored coat with a cup of tea sitting in front of her. She was 60 years old with silver hair and a face that was both delicate and precise. You could tell she'd spent her whole life perfecting her composure, but honestly, she looked tired of it. "Thank you for coming," Ren said as she sat down. "Thank you," Petra answered, "for not bringing anyone else." Petra's hands were wrapped around her teacup, and her left hand shook just a little. Ren could see it wasn't from nerves, it was something else. "I was diagnosed 14 months ago," Petra said, catching Ren's glance. "Stage 2. We are managing it." "I'm sorry, don't be." It made things much clearer. She looked out at the park, at all the people with their coffee and their own normal problems. I was the second witness. When James signed that contract, I was in the room. Conrad asked me to be there, saying it was just a formality. So I signed it. I didn't read it carefully. I trusted Conrad knew what he was doing. She took a deep breath. I have trusted Conrad for 37 years. Most of that time it cost me very little. This year I realized just how high that price really was. Ren's voice was steady. "Would you provide a sworn affidavit confirming you were the second witness?" "Yes," she said, without even hesitating. "My lawyer prepared one 3 weeks ago. I have been waiting for the right person to ask." Ren just stared at her. "You have been waiting?" "I watched the news, Ms. Calloway. When I saw you filed the lawsuit, I knew you were coming." She reached into her handbag, took out a sealed legal envelope, and slid it across the table. "I need you to understand something, though. I am not doing this for your case, or for me, or even for the right reasons. I am doing it because," she paused, her jaw tightening, "because I knew your father. I met him once, at that contract signing. He was a kind man, so proud of his work. And I watched Conrad take that away from him, and I did nothing. And then he died, and I have been doing nothing ever since." She looked right at Ren. "You deserved better. Your father deserved better. That is the only thing I am sure of." Ren held the envelope, completely unable to speak. "There is one more thing," Petra said, her voice now quiet. "Conrad and Sloan set up that whole scene you saw that night." "The phone call?" Beckett was on a real work call with Sloan. She timed it to look intimate, for when Conrad knew you would be home. They needed you gone. The entire world around Ren went completely silent. "Beckett did not know," she whispered. "He knew nothing. Conrad told him you had left because you were unhappy, that you had found someone else." Petra's gaze was solid and unwavering. "He believed it because he already felt guilty. Guilty for working too much, for not really seeing you. Guilt makes people believe things that they shouldn't." Ren looked down at the envelope in her hands. "He looked for you," Petra said quietly. "For almost a year, Conrad told him to stop. Said it wasn't dignified. So eventually," she trailed off, He eventually stopped, but he did look. Wren stood up. She carefully tucked the envelope into her large tote bag. "Thank you, Mrs. Lauren. Petra," she put on her coat. "I hope your treatment goes well." She walked away through Bryant Park and just disappeared into the crowd. Her face was a perfect calm mask. Her hands were completely steady. She refused to let herself feel what Petra had just told her. Not yet. Not there. And certainly not in the middle of everything. There were 29 days left. She had the affidavit. She had work to do. She would feel all the other things later. She always did. Nova found the email chain at 11:40 p.m. on a Wednesday, hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table. 3 empty coffee cups stood right beside her. She had that focused look she gets when she is about to crack something open. "Wren," she said. "Come here." Wren came over. The email chain was from 3 years ago. It came from an internal Lauren Meridian server, which Nova got into through a security hole she refused to explain. There were 12 messages in total, all between Conrad Lauren and Sloan Mercer, starting 8 days before the night Wren had walked out. She read them one by one. The first 5 were all about business. The IPO timeline, the restructuring plan, a risk assessment of the Callaway contract. Then came message 6 from Conrad. "We need her out of the picture before she finds the Callaway files. Beck will not act. We have to handle it ourselves." Message 7 from Sloan. "I know exactly how to do it. Trust me." Then came message 12. It was sent the night of the dinner. Done. She is gone. Wren stood at the kitchen table and read the entire email chain 2 times. Then she set the laptop down and walked to the bedroom doorway. Theo was asleep. She listened to him breathing for a moment, then came back and sat down. "He did not know," she said. "No," Nova said. "They told him I left because I was unhappy. Because I had—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "He believed them. He was already feeling guilty," Nova said. Petra was right. Guilt is a door people leave unlocked. She paused. "It does not make him innocent, Wren. He still stopped looking for you. He still chose to believe it. I know. You still deserve everything you are fighting for. I know that too." Wren leaned back in her chair and just stared up at the ceiling. Sloan knew Beckett was going to come after her eventually, didn't she? That is why she got close to Conrad first. 4. Protection. If the IPO is a success, Conrad protects her. If it fails, she still has whatever she has managed to steal. Nova pulled up another file. "I found a secondary account. She has been quietly selling off Lauren Meridian's smaller assets for 14 months, just under the reporting threshold. It all adds up to about $4 million. Wren looked at her sister. "She has been robbing them." "She has been robbing him," Nova corrected. "Conrad is the one who trusted her. Beckett's name is on the company, but Conrad has been the one actually running things." Wren was quiet for a second. "Send the subsidiary information to Jasper. He needs to know for the hearing." She paused. "And send an anonymous tip to the SEC. Just the numbers. No name attached. Let them find her themselves." Nova started typing. "And Beckett?" Wren looked at the email chain still open on the screen. Conrad's words, "She is gone. Done. He gets to find out the same way I found out," she said. "By seeing the evidence right in front of him and having to decide whether to believe it." She closed the laptop. "We have 22 days. I want to be ready for everything." She went to bed at midnight. Lying there in the dark, she thought about a man who had looked for her for a year and then just stopped. She thought about what it felt like to be the one who had been looking for justice for 3 years and had not stopped. She thought about Theo, who deserved a father, and about herself, who deserved answers, and her father's name on a contract that had been worthless until now. She turned over, closed her eyes, and slept. She had stopped waiting for things to be fair. She had started making them fair herself. That was the only way she could live with this. The press conference was at Beckett Lauren's office in Midtown. It was a sleek conference room on the 28th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing south. Manhattan was spread out below them like a map. Wren had picked the time herself, 10 a.m. on a Thursday, 30 minutes before the New York Stock Exchange opened. She wore a charcoal blazer with her hair pulled back. She carried certified copies of the contract, Petra's affidavit, and a one-page summary she had written herself at midnight on the fourth draft. She stood at the front of the room, facing 12 financial journalists, 2 wire services, and a camera from CNBC. Jasper stood to her left. Nova stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the door. Wren spoke clearly, without any drama. She laid out the details of the contract. Her father's design work, the royalty clause, the 8 years of unpaid royalties. She presented the legal filing. She presented Petra's affidavit, pointing out it was given voluntarily and without any pressure. She presented the liquidation numbers Nova had found, noting the SEC had been tipped off and was now investigating. She answered 4 questions. She never once raised her voice. She did not mention Beckett's name. At 10:22 a.m., she thanked the room and stepped away. At 10:31 a.m., Lauren Meridian pre-market shares dropped 11%. At 10:47 a.m., Conrad Lauren appeared at the back of the room. Security had not stopped him, because no one thought he would show up himself. And that told Wren everything she needed to know about how badly they had been blindsided. He was in control, but just barely. "This is a fabrication," he announced to the room. "This is a disgruntled family using a decades-old document to interfere." "Mr. Lauren," Jasper said calmly, "Petra Lauren's affidavit is notarized, witnessed, and filed with the court as of this morning. The contract is legally authenticated. I would encourage you to speak with your lawyer." Conrad looked at Wren for the very first time. She looked right back at him, not with anger, but with something quieter, more final. Recognition. She saw him for exactly what he was. "My father built your flagship tower." She said it quietly, not for the cameras, but just for him. "He died believing he was a failure. Ethan, I want you to carry that." She grabbed her bag. "We redone here." She walked to the elevator with Nova right beside her. As the doors opened, Wren looked back one last time and saw Beckett Lauren by the window. She hadn't known he was there. He was just standing there, watching her. His lawyers were talking to him, but he was listening. She held his gaze for a second, then 2, before the elevator doors closed. In the lobby, Nova sighed. "How are you feeling?" Wren answered honestly. "Like I just put down something incredibly heavy," she said. "Good heavy or bad heavy?" "Just heavy." She pushed into the street as cold air hit her face. "Get Jasper on the phone. I need to review the settlement before the day ends." She was already steps ahead, as always. But for the first time, everyone could see it. After the press conference, Beckett didn't go back to his office. He just started walking, leaving his phone in his jacket. He walked south through Midtown, past the Empire State Building, without even looking up, heading toward the river. The city rushed around him, completely uncaring. He walked for about 45 minutes until his legs gave out. He sat on a bench near the East River. It was cold, but he barely noticed. He thought about the press conference and the real, original contract. He thought of James Calloway, the architect from his childhood, blueprints, the man his father said had made their family. And then he thought of Wren on that stage. The words she spoke to his father changed everything in that room. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "I need everything. Every email, file, and message between Conrad Thorne and Sloan Mercer for the past 4 years. Send it to my personal email. And don't tell anyone his next call was to Sloan." She answered cheerfully, like it was any other day. He noted her tone. "We need to meet," he said. "Of course." "Where?" "My office." "In 1 hour." He made it back in 30 minutes and was already digging through the files when she arrived. He found it in the 7th email and read it twice to be certain. Then he saw message 12, which simply said, "Done. She has gone." He put his phone down, flattened his hands on his desk, and took a deep breath. When Sloan walked in, she wore a look of professional concern, like a well-rehearsed actress. She sat across from him. He didn't offer her coffee. He just turned his laptop screen toward her and waited. He watched her read, watched her mind race for a way out, for a lie that would stick. Beckett Dante, his voice was so quiet it stopped her cold. I am not asking for an explanation. I am telling you, these have already been sent to my lawyers and to the SEC. I flagged those withdrawals myself. He paused. That is the only conversation we are going to have. She stood up, her composure flawless. But her hands betrayed her. He always noticed the small details. She left without a word. Alone in his office, he thought about Ren leaving their penthouse 3 years ago. At the time, he convinced himself it was just a rough patch. He remembered the year he spent searching for her. He had genuinely looked for her, not just faked it for his father. He remembered stopping only because his father insisted Ren had moved on, and that letting her go was the kindest thing to do. He couldn't believe he had actually fallen for that lie. He made one more phone call, but it was not to his legal team. He called a therapist his doctor had recommended for 2 years and scheduled an appointment for the next morning. Then, in his silent office, he finally let himself feel the weight of his horrible mistakes. It was not a pleasant feeling, but he sat with it. Conrad called an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. on Friday. Jasper knew it was a bad sign. Men like Conrad Thorne only call those meetings when they are certain they have a winning hand. He was wrong about the cards, but he did not know it yet. Ren was not there. She was 2 floors down in a conference room with Nova and Jasper, watching a live feed. Theo was safe with the babysitter. At 9 a.m., on only 5 hours of sleep, Ren felt completely focused. The board had 11 members. Conrad had spent 20 years building his majority, but 2 members had been following the SEC inquiry. 2 others had now seen the real numbers. And Beckett had personally called 4 board members the night before. Ren knew this because Jasper had been tracking their phones for a week. The meeting began and Conrad moved fast. He tried to table all claims against Thorne Meridian, and then he moved to remove Beckett as CEO. The first motion failed, 5-6. Conrad's face didn't change. He moved to the second one. It failed, 4-7. Beckett had secured his votes before 8 a.m. that morning. Conrad had underestimated his son for the very last time. He stood, pointing at Beckett, his voice tight with rage. You are throwing away everything I built for you, and everything I protected. His voice was steady with a finality Ren would have recognized. She once thought it was coldness, but now she knew it was the sound of a settled decision. You destroyed a man's career over a contract, Beckett said. You let him die thinking he was a failure. You made my wife leave because of a lie. He paused. And then you told me to stop looking for her. After a long silence, he said, I am done letting you decide what is worth protecting. By 10:15 a.m., Conrad was being escorted out of the building. By 11:30 a.m., the SEC announced a formal investigation into Sloan Mercer for securities fraud. Her accounts were frozen, and her access was revoked. Downstairs, Jasper closed his laptop. Nova leaned back, covered her face, and breathed a sigh of relief. Ren just sat with her hands folded. She had watched the feed until the vote was done, then turned it off. She did not need to see Conrad leave or watch the rest of it unfold. Just knowing it was over was enough. The settlement proposal, she said. Is Beckett's team ready? Jasper nodded. They called this morning. Before the meeting, he hesitated. He called Ren, not his lawyers, him personally. She absorbed that, her expression unreadable. Schedule it for Monday, she said. I want the weekend. She texted the babysitter, home by noon. Can you stay for lunch? Then she stood and said, let's go get Theo. For the first time in 31 days, she had said something that was not about the case. It felt like opening a window in a room that had been sealed shut. The meeting was that Monday morning at a neutral law firm in Rockefeller Center. Ren made sure she got there early, so she was already at the table when Beckett walked in. She had wondered what this would feel like, facing him across a table with lawyers and with a clear mission. With all their buried secrets finally laid bare. She realized it was like standing in a house she had designed herself, but never had the chance to live in. Beckett sat opposite her, his lawyers taking their places. He looked like a man who had practiced a long speech, only to throw it all away at the last second. "Before we start," he said, speaking only to her, "I want to say something off the record." His lawyer touched his arm, but Beckett gently brushed it aside. "I believed the wrong story," he said. "I'd failed so many times in our marriage that when my father offered a simple explanation, I took it. That is not an excuse. It is just what happened. I looked for you for almost a year, and then I just stopped. I have thought about that moment every single day since." He paused. "I did not know about the contract or your father. There are no words for how truly sorry I am." Ren looked him right in the eye. "I know you did not know," she said. "I have known for 2 weeks." His expression flickered. "But that does not change the cost," she said. "My father's name. 3 years of my life. Theo growing up without." She stopped herself. "It doesn't change the cost." "No," he agreed. "It does not." The negotiation lasted for 4 hours. Thorn Meridian would pay the full royalty, compounded over 8 years, in cash. $47 million would be paid into the James A. Callaway Trust. Ren would also establish a design fellowship in her father's name at his old school, the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture. And Callaway Studio would get a formal public acknowledgement of her father's design work for the flagship building. That also meant a permanent plaque on the building itself. Ren signed the papers at 2:15 p.m. As people began to leave the room, Beckett stayed seated. Ren packed up her documents, completely aware that he was still there. She let the silence fill the space between them. "I want to meet him," Beckett said softly. "When you are ready, when it is right for him. I am just asking for a chance to be there for him." Ren straightened her posture and looked at him. He met her eyes with a new kind of honesty, totally unguarded. It was something she had never seen, even when they were happy. "I will talk to my lawyer about making arrangements," she said. "Formal ones. He needs structure, not confusion. Whatever you decide." She grabbed her bag and walked to the door, but then she stopped and turned back. "There is a therapist," she said, "Dr. Reed. On 68th and Lex. She is good. She helped me realize that you cannot force someone else to show up. Learning to show up for yourself must come first." She put a business card on the table and avoided looking at his face. Then she walked out into the Rockefeller Center hallway, past the Christmas decorations that were already going up, weeks too early. She took the elevator down to the street, where the cold November air hit her. Nova was outside, leaning against a wall, eating a granola bar. "Done?" Nova asked. "Done," Ren said. Nova passed her half of the granola bar, and they walked toward the subway together. Ren did not look back at the building, not even once. The city just buzzed around them, moving at its usual speed. And that was perfect. It was what she needed. She knew Dex Harlan would come looking for what he was owed. But she never imagined he would show up at Nova's door instead of hers. Nova was in the kitchen of their sublet apartment, packing the last of their things. They were moving out at the end of the week, both going home. Ren was off to LA, ready to expand Callaway Studio to New York. Nova was headed back to Brooklyn and whatever came next. The apartment was a mess of boxes, tape, and the quiet sadness of leaving a place that was starting to feel like home. Dex knocked at 7 p.m. Nova opened the door. "She is not here," Nova said. "I know," he answered. "I was hoping to speak with you." Nova watched him for a second, then stepped aside. "You have 2 minutes." He walked in, his eyes sweeping over the boxes, noticing how they had made this small apartment a home. There were stacks of books. A child's drawings were taped to the kitchen wall. A Kindle lay on the counter next to 2 coffee mugs. It was all evidence of a life being put back together in a temporary space. "The IPO restructuring is moving forward without the clause we fought over," he said. "The Callaway settlement is a separate issue. My interests are safe." "Great," Nova said flatly. "You got what you wanted." "I did," he paused. "I also brought something real to the negotiation." The funding he provided meant Ren could move as fast as she needed. Without it, the timing could have been completely wrong. "She would have found a way," Nova said, her voice sharp. She always does. Dex was quiet for a beat. He was looking at the kids' drawings on the wall. They were crooked crayon buildings, but drawn with a lot of heart. How old is he? 3.5. Does he know what his mother did? He knows she fixed something that was broken, Nova replied. And that is enough for now. He nodded, then looked straight at Nova. Sloan and I were a couple for 2 years, about 6 years ago, and I did not see what she was. Not really. I thought I did. I thought I understood her. But I was wrong. She is he paused, searching for the word. She is very good at showing people only what they want to see. Nova crossed her arms. And you are telling me this why? Because you dug into my past, and you are still looking at me like I owe you an explanation, he said. So I wanted to give you one. Nova looked him over. You are not a good man, Dex. No, you used a dead man's legal problem just to get ahead. Yes, but you did keep your promise. You stayed out of the way, and you did not make things worse. She tilted her head slightly. That is about the best I can say for you. He almost smiled. That might be the most honest review I have ever gotten. Do not get too excited. She opened the door. Send the final bill to Jasper. We will look it over. She paused. And for what it is worth, Sloan chose to be who she is. That is on her. You were just wrong about her. Being wrong does not make you responsible for her actions. He stood there in the doorway for a long second. Thank you. Do not thank me. It was not a compliment. She shut the door. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, then grabbed her phone and dialed Ren. Dex stopped by, she said. I know. I saw him leave the building from across the street.
You were watching?
I wanted to make sure he left without causing any trouble. Nova laughed, a warm, brief sound. He did. Ren, he isn't dangerous. He's a strategist. Most dangerous people are, Ren shot back. But I know. A comfortable quiet settled between them, the kind only sisters really understand. We are going home, Nova said, her voice soft. Yeah, Ren agreed. We are finally going home. Through the kitchen window, the city just kept going, massive and indifferent. It carried the weight of everyone's problems and never slowed down for a second. Nova made some tea while Ren went back to packing. She sealed the last box with tape, feeling that deep satisfaction that comes when a job is well and truly done. Ren chose Central Park for their meeting. It was neutral ground, and Theo loved it there, especially near the conservatory garden with its big fountain and wide paths. It gave a 3.5-year-old plenty of room to run at his favorite speed. Full tilt. She'd told Theo about it the week before, choosing her words with care. She'd said, "Someone wants to meet you. His name is Beckett. He is your father." Theo had been quiet for a long time, thinking it over. He had a serious way of processing new facts that reminded her so much of her own dad, making her throat tighten in a way she was still getting used to. Then Theo asked, "Does he know how to build things?" "I am not sure," Ren answered, being honest. "You can ask him." It was a Saturday in late November. The air was chilly, but the sun was shining. The park was doing its best to look peaceful. Ren sat on a bench about 20 feet away from the fountain. Theo stood at the edge of the walkway, just watching the water. He had insisted on wearing his red rain boots, despite the lack of rain, and she didn't have the energy to argue. Beckett arrived exactly on time. He was dressed carefully, but not too formally, the way you dressed when you know something is important. A dark coat, no tie. He looked at Ren first, and she gave him the smallest of nods. He walked toward Theo, stopping a few feet away, and crouched down to be at eye level with the little boy who was already studying him like an interesting new puzzle. "Hi," Beckett said. "Hi," Theo replied. Beckett glanced at the fountain. "That is a pretty good fountain." "It is okay," Theo said, giving a fair assessment. "The one in Griffith Park is better. It has more water." "I have never been to Griffith Park." Theo took in this new piece of information. "It is in California, I know. I have never been." "You should go," Theo advised him. "It is good." He looked Beckett straight in the eye with a directness Ren knew was all his own. "My mama said you are my dad." "Yes," Beckett said, his voice perfectly steady. "I am. Then why have I never seen you before?" Silence hung in the air. On the bench, Wren didn't even breathe. "Because I did not know where to find you," Beckett said. "That was something that happened because of mistakes that grown-ups made, not you. It was never your fault." Theo thought about this. "Okay," he said at last, in a tone that filed the information away for later. "So, can you build things?" Something quick and complicated flashed across Beckett's face. "I am better at business, but I can learn how. Mama is good at building things," Theo said with clear admiration. "She built our whole apartment. Well, she designed it. Other people built it, but she told them how." "I know," Beckett said quietly. "She is very good at that." Theo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out 2 small wooden blocks. He carried them everywhere, like some kids carry a toy car. He held one out to Beckett. "You can have this one," he offered. "We can build something." Beckett took the little block. Then he sat right down on the cold path, crossing his legs, seemingly unconcerned about ruining his expensive coat. Theo sat down right beside him. They began, with great concentration, to build a tiny tower with 2 blocks and a stick Theo found. From her bench, Wren watched them. The November sun was a weak defense against the cold, and the park moved around them with its usual beautiful indifference. She thought of her father, of his hands on blueprints, of the things people build and the things that are taken away. And if you just refuse to give up on them, find their way back to you. They're not the same. They are never exactly the same, but they come back. She watched Theo hand Beckett another stick, like a lead architect giving orders to a new intern. She watched Beckett take it as if it were the most important task he had ever been given. She looked away toward the fountain and then up at the big sky. She let herself feel it all, the sadness, the warmth, the long years, this one morning without flinching. This was the real work, to feel everything and to stay in the moment. The city moved on. The fountain kept splashing. Her son was building something from almost nothing with his father, in the cold light of a Saturday he wouldn't remember, but that she would never, ever forget. That was enough. In fact, it was more than enough. It was everything. 6 months later, Conrad Lorne was found guilty on 2 counts of securities fraud and 1 of contract interference. His sentence was 3 years in a federal minimum security prison. His lawyers were already filing appeals that everyone knew would go nowhere and take years to fail. He showed up for the sentencing in a gray suit, surrounded by his legal team, and said nothing to anyone. Petra was not there. She was in Connecticut, finishing her 2nd round of chemotherapy. Her prognosis, Wren had heard from Jasper, had improved a lot. Sloan, Mercer pleaded guilty to securities fraud and cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a shorter sentence. She lost all of her financial licenses permanently. She moved to a smaller city and, as far as anyone knew, began to live a very quiet life. Wren would think of her sometimes and realize she felt almost nothing, which she understood was its own kind of peace. The James A. Callaway Fellowship was announced that April at the University of Pennsylvania. It was a full scholarship for new architects from low-income backgrounds, with 3 winners chosen each year. The first group was selected in June. Wren went to Philadelphia for the awards ceremony. Her mother sat in the front row and cried, just as she had at every major event for the last 30 years. And that was one of the things Wren loved most about her. Callaway Studios found its new home in a renovated Tribeca loft. The space was bright, with an open layout, and by the door, a small framed blueprint hung on the wall. It was her father's original design for the Lorne Meridian flagship, just the drawing, with his handwriting in the margins. A bronze plaque outside, which was required by the legal settlement, read, "Original design, James A. Callaway, architect." The morning it was installed, she stood in front of it and placed her hand on the cool metal. She didn't say anything, but her silence said everything. Meanwhile, Theo was now spending every other weekend with Beckett in Manhattan. Lawyers had worked out a new, fair co-parenting plan for them, a system that required a lot of effort from everyone. Beckett found a child therapist to help Theo navigate all the changes. And Wren realized he had also found Dr. Reed for himself. 6 weeks after she left that card on the table, A short text arrived from a new number. I called her. She just wrote back, "Thank you," followed by a thumbs-up emoji, and saved his number as B. It was a Saturday in May. Ren was in her Tribeca office, studying blueprints for a house in the West Village. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the huge windows, making long, soft shadows. A cold Starbucks sat on her desk as she took notes during a client call. She heard the knock on the door before she saw him. Beckett was standing in the doorway. He had come in through the main entrance, which she always left unlocked on Saturdays. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, much better than her cold Starbucks. "I was in the neighborhood," he said simply. "You live on the Upper East Side," she replied. I walked. She put her pen down and took a real look at him. The man she had loved, then lost, then fought. The man she had survived. She had come through it all different, stronger, and somehow still there. He set one of the coffees on her desk. "I wanted to ask you something," he started. She waited. And then he said, "But not today. I am not asking you today. I just wanted you to know that I am going to ask one day. When the time is right and when I feel like I have earned it." He paused and took a breath. "I am not the man I was. I know that does not fix anything. I am just showing you the direction I am heading." Ren looked from the coffee on her desk to his face. "I know," she said quietly. He just nodded, not pushing for anything more. He turned to go. "Beckett." He stopped. "Theo told me," she said, "that you are learning to build things." A real quiet change came over his face. "I am not very good at it yet." "He says you are getting better." He held her gaze for just a moment longer. And just like that, he was gone. She heard his footsteps, the ding of the elevator, and then the sounds of the city rushed back in. She picked up the coffee he had left for her. It was still warm. She took a sip and turned back to her work. In the office she had built, in the city her father had helped build. Her name was on the door. Her son's drawings were on the wall, lit by a golden light that seemed to last for as long as she needed it. The building stood. The fellowship grew. Theo built things. Ren worked. The city moved on. And every morning, the man who once had everything was slowly learning something true. The only things worth having are the things you cannot buy. He was learning. She was watching. They weren't in any hurry. This was their ending, and for now, it was enough. And that, my friends, is where our story comes to a close today. If you've stuck with me to the end, I know this story meant something to you. Maybe it was Ren's quiet strength when her whole world came crashing down. Or maybe it was her refusal to give up, even when the odds were completely against her. Or maybe you just saw a piece of your own journey in her story. Because that's the real takeaway here, the one I want you to remember. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. Ren didn't win because life suddenly decided to be fair. She won because she refused to let injustice write her final chapter. She rebuilt her world quietly, patiently, and with an incredible inner power. She didn't do it for revenge, she did it for love. Love for her father's name, her son's future, and for the woman she was becoming. The real lesson is this: healing is not some loud, grand spectacle. It rarely announces itself. It looks like opening your laptop at midnight, tired and afraid, and just choosing to take one more step forward. So, wherever you are, if life has dealt you a truly unfair hand, something painful that feels impossible to move past, think of Ren. And remember this: a woman with nothing left to lose is the most powerful force in the world. If this story connected with you, please take a moment to click the like button. It really helps our channel get these stories out to more people who might need them. And for more videos like this one every week, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss what's next. We also invite you to share this with someone who could use this message today. Because sometimes the right story shows up at just the right moment. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video. This story is an original work of fiction created for your entertainment. All characters, including Ren Calloway, Rebecca Lorne, Nova Calloway, Conrad Lorne, Petra Lorne, Sloan Mercer, Dex Harlan, and Jasper Whitfield are entirely fictional. They do not represent any real people, living or dead. Any resemblance to actual persons, events, groups, or locations is purely coincidental. The situations you saw in this story, like legal or business issues, were invented for the sake of the narrative. This content should not be taken as actual legal advice, financial guidance, or factual reporting. Any names of places, brands, or companies were used only to help create the story's setting. This does not imply any partnership with them or an endorsement from them. This video is for mature audiences who enjoy emotional, character-driven dramas. Our goal is to share meaningful stories that inspire thought, empathy, and hope, not to present fiction as fact. Thank you for watching.